Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hey everybody, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Good to see you. Hope everyone is doing well. We've got a big lineup on the show today and we're going to kick it off by talking about cattle production. And I'm sure that sometime over the last month or so, many of you watching took some time to look through the numbers and see how much it took to produce a pound of weaned calf last year. Nebraska Extension beef educator Dr. Berger joined me on the show to explain what the most recent figures tell us and advice for looking ahead.
As we look back at 2018, I think for cow-calf producers it was a fair year. From a production perspective, the spring of last year, there were some blizzard conditions that happened across the state that sure resulted in some greater calf loss than normal for some cow-calf producers. The summer was pretty good from a forage production standpoint across much of the state. We would have had above average precipitation, and that was I think a benefit in terms of the amount of grass we grew, but then a challenge to some folks in terms of getting that forage into a hay bale. As we look to the fall and winter, we saw some pretty good calf prices. I would say, in that $1.50 to $1.85 area. So, respectable in terms of cow-calf prices for calves, depending on where you were at in terms of if those calves were weaned or if they'd had a regiment of vaccine prior to the sale of those calves, really impacted whether you were on the lower end or upper end of that range.
And for unit cost of production numbers, what do you see here? Any idea where you see these going?
So from a cost of production perspective, I think I continue to see those holding steady or actually increasing. If you look historically, Livestock Market Information Center shows some annual cow costs. They've tracked it for 30 years. The last 15 years really started to see those annual cow costs ramp up. Across the United States, back in 2003, they estimated around $400 to $500 for annual cow costs. Today, somewhere in that $800 to $900. In Nebraska, if we look at cow costs from an economic perspective, meaning we include all cost, opportunity cost, labor, probably pushing close to that $900 to $1,000 per cow. Not every cow weans a calf, so we're over $1,000 per calf produced if we look at it from a strictly economic perspective.
And are there cost areas that producers can think about reducing this year or into the years ahead?
In my mind, there's really three big areas from a cow cost perspective. We're looking at feed costs being around 40 to 70% of annual cow costs. Next, second big item will be labor and equipment. That one continues to present some challenges for us. And then the third one would be cow replacement cost or depreciation. I think really it's just knowing what your costs are, looking at each of these different segments, thinking about what the input is that you're putting into the production system, what's the value you're getting out. And then I think being opportunistic to think creatively around, is there some ways we can get more for what we put in, or are there some ways that we can cut some cost and not drastically impact production?
Gotcha. And what are some of the biggest questions that producers ask you regarding production costs? Do you have any advice for them?
I think some of the big challenges we see is looking at feed cost and just what's happening there. I've recently seen an increase specifically in distillers grains in Nebraska. That's a pretty major input for many cow-calf producers from a supplement standpoint, and so looking at alternatives. So I really encourage people to price things on a cost per unit of energy, cost per unit of protein, and what did it cost to get it into the cow. And so we're including all cost with waste in that. Putting a pencil to that, evaluating what your situation is, can help you make good decisions from a supplement standpoint.
Is there anything else you're keeping your eye on as it relates to the beef sector for the first quarter of 2019?
Well, I think we want to continue to keep an eye on what's happening in terms of our input costs. I think we're going to continue to see just some challenges there. And so being creative, thinking about specifically those areas I talked about, are there things we can do from a management perspective to leverage ourselves as we look at those? I think also just as cow-calf producers think about their own operations, what their skill sets are, what they think their competitive advantage is, and how can they further develop that in today's market environment.
And finally, what are some other resources out there that producers can take advantage of?
Well, I think just again, looking at the resources that are available at the beef.unl.edu website, a lot of good research-based information there that they can apply to their production system, thinking through, again, their management and just really putting a sharp pencil to how they think about what they do with their cow-calf enterprise.
And one more time, that website is beef.unl.edu. And remember, you can always reach out to your local extension office with any questions too. Next week, Aaron will be back on the show to talk about planning for calving season. Moving on now, and one thing cattle producers don't have to worry about is pests eating their profits. Not the case, however, for soybean producers. In late spring of last year, entomologists in Nebraska and surrounding states received reports of dead soybean plants consistent with soybean gall midge infestations. UNL Entomologist Dr. Justin McMechan came on the show to give some insight into this relatively new pest and what it means for farmers come next season.
It's a new pest, but it's been around since 2011. We just didn't have a name for it. It showed up late in the season, usually in August, on damaged or disease-infected crops, so soybeans. And so raised little concern for us. We didn't do a lot of research on it because we didn't figure there was much economic losses. And it was 2016 and 17 showed up again. Then 18, it showed up quite early, about 2 months ahead of when we would expect it in late June. And it was already killing plants in late June. Oh. And so a large effort amongst multiple states to figure out, first of all, where it was and how much the losses were that early in the season. In fact, 4 states were infested. So here in Nebraska, we had 23 counties infested. Iowa was infested. The little bottom corner of Minnesota and South Dakota. All the states were seeing very similar losses. And so it raised quite a concern over basically its potential to be a primary pest and not some secondary of disease or mechanical damage.
Mm-hmm. Any of those states feeling the effects more than others?
I'd say here in Nebraska we're definitely feeling the effects. I can't fully speak for the other states, although we've been in conversation, but it was widespread throughout this state. Mostly the eastern half of the state tailed off as we went south. I actually took yield data on a field just south of the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center, and they did not have yield for the first 100 feet into the field. So I can guarantee you that producer felt it, and there was still a 20% loss at 400 feet, which we consider we're off the field edge. So producers are feeling it. We're having a roundtable discussion to figure out how many of them are feeling those effects.
So what's the best way to manage the soybean gall midge if a producer finds it in their field?
Yeah, you know, I wish we had good management strategies for them. It's so new to us, and we've had such little time to study it basically this past season that we don't have a lot of good recommendations. We are being very proactive this spring. So in August we collected the adults for the first time and got a chance to see those, and so we're confident we can track emergence this spring of those adults. We're not sure where they're coming from, whether it's the existing soybean field that was infested, a field border, maybe it's where the wooded areas are, but regardless we'll be able to track those when they emerge, and if producers have had issues, that might be the time when we catch those first ones emerging to apply an insecticide. We're looking at planting dates as part of some of the grants we've submitted. So we're trying to get a mix of both cultural and those preventative pest management practices, so we're not relying totally on insecticides going forward.
Mm-hmm. Only soybeans, or anybody else need to be concerned?
Only soybeans so far, which I expect it to stay like that. We do know of other species around the globe like this that we already know are not. They're related to this species, but distantly related enough to call this a new species. And their insights are helping us a little bit. We have to be careful, though. One's Japan, so making interpretations from Japan to here is tough.
Sure. So what does it look like?
The adults are about 1/4 inch long. That's what a lot of people haven't seen. I'll talk about the maggots in a second, but they're about 1/4 inch long, and they have these black and white bands down their legs. They look a lot like a mosquito, except they're quite small, and if their wings pick up, you can see this orange abdomen. That's really what the larvae look like, or the maggots as well. They transition from white to orange as they go through the 3 instars, or we assume 3 instars. And people find them in the base of the soybean plants. So for producers walking their field this spring, you know, after the plants are above the V5 stage, that's when we started to see some problems. And the plants are snapping off or appear dark at the soil surface. I'd recommend they pick those up and split them open. And if they do have soybean gall midge, they'll start finding those larvae if it's like last year. And so they're little maggots with 11 segments in them that pretty easy to see, and they can get into pretty significant numbers. So we had one plant with 150 larvae on it. So
no kidding.
They're there. You can find them.
Yeah, no kidding. All right, so if somebody suspects that they're having trouble with this pest, is it something where they should call somebody out to take a look at it, or maybe send in a specimen to the office to get it checked out? What do you suggest?
Yeah, we're reasonably confident, even based on a photo, that we're probably looking at the same thing. So if a producer suspects it in their county, or a crop consultant or ag professional, if they snap a photo and send it to me via email or through my Twitter handle, I can likely go from there. And if they've seen it, that's great for us to know where it is. We're still trying to figure out where it is in this state.
Sure.
So anybody communicating with us on it will be helpful.
Definitely something you need to keep an eye out for. We'll do the same and pass along updates when we have them. It's time for this week's trivia question, and don't tell the Soybean Gall Midge about this one, because our trivia question is about soybeans. According to the most recent data released by the USDA, what Nebraska county leads the state in soybean production? Is the answer York County, Garden County, Buffalo County, or maybe it's Phelps County? Make your guess, and I'll have the answer after Al's forecast. Moving on to this week's market report, and tell me if you've heard this one yet. Still in the midst of a government shutdown. So if you rely on the USDA reports, what are you to do? This week's analyst has some advice. Plus, China's president says his country's economy could be in trouble. We'll see what that means for trade here at home. And Brazil was banking on a big soybean crop this season. So how's that looking? Darin Newsom is our analyst this week. We sat down on Wednesday to get his take on the markets and the lack of USDA reports.
I've always been of the belief that if we watch the markets, if we watch what's happening, if we watch the trends, if we watch the spreads, if we watch these things going on, we can tell, not only who's doing what, but what the fundamentals of a market actually are. We won't know, the exact bushels, but we don't know the exact bushels when we have USDA reports. So I have always argued that we don't need those things to create unnecessary volatility, to create, some people say opportunities, but I think it takes opportunities away and it distorts the market. Let's let the market speak for itself. Let's let it work without this undue influence, and it certainly seems to be working now during this shutdown.
And so from folks that you've talked to, where are they getting their info right now if they really do rely on those reports? Because we have a lot of viewers who really take a lot of stock into what those reports say. So what would you tell someone who is really missing those reports? Where can they get more information?
Well, first off, they can get better information from any comic book that they decide to buy. So they've got that going for them. If they're missing the reports, maybe after this show, they won't anymore, because they'll realize that the information is out there. Now, if you want the hard data, the actual numbers, or what some people believe the numbers to be, there are private services out there that do this sort of thing. And they use more up-to-date technology than what USDA does. And there's no political game behind it. Now, some will say, well, yeah, but they're traders. That's where you have to differentiate. Are you getting your information from trading companies? Are you getting it just from private research companies? That's what the industry is moving towards, is these private research companies that provide this information. So it's out there. But if you don't actually need the numbers, and quite honestly, nobody really does, what we need to know is the market bullish or bearish? Is its long-term view bullish or bearish? And then all we got to do, it's very simple. You pull up a quote screen, you look at the spreads. If you've got a strong carry in the market, in other words, deferred contracts are higher priced than nearby, market's telling you right now they don't want it. They don't want your commodity up, in the short term. They're willing to pay you a large part of storage and interest to not sell it to them. They're bearish. If there's very little carry or an inverted market, they need it right now. Supply and demand.
All right.
It's very simple to read.
Excellent. All right, so got that out of our system.
Yes.
All right, moving on to trade, and could you tell our viewers how concerned you are with relations with China right now? Because we've talked about tariffs a lot on this show. Mm-hmm. Now I've been reading that over in China, the demand for soybeans is down. Mm-hmm. China's president even said that their economy is in serious danger. Mm-hmm. So what's happening over there?
Well, the trade has been a problem. And you know, I think we've got 6 years in a row now where we've had the 6th largest production years here domestically for corn and soybeans. So we continue to increase our supplies. And while we're increasing our supplies, the one thing that we couldn't do was threaten demand. Well, we've done that. You know, we didn't get into the TPP which was the Asian, which was the Trans-Pacific Agreement, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we didn't get into that, and that included some of our largest corn customers. We got into a NAFTA fight with 2 of our largest trading companies, Mexico and Canada, and so that was a potential threat to corn, and it could still turn out to be a potential threat to corn demand. And now, of course, we're in this, you know, quote unquote trade war with China, who is the world's largest soybean buyer. So they aren't buying U.S. soybeans right now, or if they are, they're shipping the bare minimum. You know, they've seen their demand go down because of the swine illness that they've got going on, that I don't know is being reported. I'm saying that it's being reported, but I don't know that we know the full scope of it yet. Plus, they were waiting to see if Brazil was actually going to raise their next record crop. And that seems to be the key to all of this. Is Brazil going to have that record crop that refills their storage? They can start shipping, you know, they've been shipping at a record pace. Will that continue? We basically missed out on our 6-month window of making soybean shipments, and we didn't hardly move anything, particularly over the last 3 months. We may move a little bit now as South American supplies start to come back in during harvest. So we've got a very narrow window at this point, but I don't see our shipments picking up. I don't see demand for U.S. soybeans coming anywhere near what USDA's last projection was for exports of 1.9. We're not even going to be close to that. So, you know, we look at the spreads, we look at the overall forward curve of the soybean market, we look at national average basis, and everything's telling us the same story. We have way too many soybeans on hand. We don't know how many, but we have way too many.
And it just seems like with all this inventory, where's all that going to go? It just seems it's going to be trouble for everybody.
Yeah, it is. You know, it's going to be a concern. And we're coming up on planting of the next season. You know, the debate is already out there. We're going to see more corn acres, more soybean. Is it going to be about the same with both of them coming in at about 90 million acres? That's very possible. You know, we may lose a few acres to some spring wheat. We may, you know, we were supposed to lose some acres to winter wheat, but because of the planting season being miserable weather-wise, we may not have seen all that happen. So, huge question mark right now. The bottom line is we have too much soybeans on hand, supplies. We have a large amount of corn, but not a burdensome amount. Again, if we look at our forward curves in the corn market, we look at the basis, it's not as burdensome in corn. So that means we've been moving corn, means we've still got good demand for corn. We just can't do anything to change that at this point, because we will get to a point where we have too much corn on hand as well.
And you mentioned the swine flu. Anything else internationally that you're looking at right now?
Well, we've got, you know, the latest round of, you know, weather markets from South America. So this is the huge question. Okay, demand is coming down in China because of the swine illness. We've got, you know, this thought that we were going to see 120 million metric tons plus in Brazil alone. Now that's being trimmed back to 118, maybe 116. How much it pulls back, how much it continues to be whittled down, still remains to be seen. The market isn't reflecting any concern at this point, but it could. If this drought continues, if they continue to have some dry weather problems, they're going to continue to pull their production down, and there's just not going to be as many soybeans from Brazil on the market. Will it change the overall market situation? As I said, right now, soybean situation saying it won't, but it could down the road. So that's the next thing we really have to watch, is how much is this drought actually going to affect their harvest level.
You can get more from Darin at his website. That's DarinNewsom.com. And we'll have more with him next week and get his thoughts on cattle, pigs, and winter wheat. Brandon Christensen likes bringing new technology to his farm near Plainview. When that technology can make management a little easier, then it's even better. That's why he welcomed the opportunity to try a new full-color capacitive touchscreen irrigation control module from FieldWise. It was unveiled in December 2017 and made commercially available for the first time last year. Read about Christensen's search for the right package for his center pivots and why he decided on this particular Zim Pat 5 Plus module in the January Nebraska Farmer. It's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension ag climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, I think it's safe to say much of the state is dealing with a big chill. How's the end of January looking for us?
Well, Troy, you're correct. It looks like the cold air is going to basically hang in here for at least through the end of the month, possibly just a little bit longer. I'm almost nervous to make this forecast after last week's fiasco. The models actually were showing more of the storm on Saturday than they were our little event that we had earlier this week that dropped some pretty significant snowfall across portions of south central and southeast Nebraska along with the freezing drizzle. We did see some cool conditions come in during the Thursday time frame. We've seen a little bit of relief yesterday. We'll see some relief this weekend before once again the polar Arctic air moves into our region. So let's take a look at the upper air model. And here we are today with that cold air that is going to be moving over the Great Lakes. Right coming down the pipeline, we have a northerly flow, but at the surface we have a southerly flow, so we're still seeing some warming. Here's a little surface low that will bring the first wave of energy through our region. That's going to slide to the southeast and clip northeastern Nebraska. So we're going to see a lot of little light flurry activity out to the north and to the east of us, and maybe some of that overspread in eastern Nebraska. And then we start to see a more northwest-southeast flow across the state, bringing a little bit chillier air in, particularly as we get into Sunday night, as here's that low-pressure system that will move rapidly toward the southeast, bringing some very Arctic air into our region. Brutal temperatures for the start of the week. You can kind of see on Monday we have this deep trough here. We're going to be looking at sub-zero lows across portions of eastern Nebraska and much of the upper Midwest, as low pressure will drive a pretty potent storm system across the lower Great Lakes region. We'll see a little bit of flurry activity in our region, and then we will see an even deeper troughing action as we get into Tuesday morning. That's probably going to be the coldest of this period as we have a straight north flow in the upper atmosphere coming to the south. High pressure moving in from the northern plains is going to keep us cool, but the main activity really remains to the east of us with a very significant storm system that's going to move up the eastern seaboard once again. Now as we get into Wednesday, we're going to start to see some relaxation. We have one more battle of high pressure to move through the region if the models are correct, and then we'll start to see this all area slide toward the southeast. So a little bit of flurry activity would not be out of the question, but there's just no moisture with the source coming from the north. And as you get on the day Thursday, you can start to see that we have a northwest to southeast flow. It's a little bit milder conditions. Surface lows are indicated to start to develop in North Dakota and across to southeastern Colorado. There's just not a lot of moisture to feed this system, so most of the activity will remain to our north. And as we get in the day on Friday, we're going to start to see some ridging as we have another trough in the west starting to build in. So it looks like we're going to see our ridging pattern kind of shift a little bit toward the east. The trough to the east of us is going to break down. We're going to start to see some precipitation move into the western United States, and this bears watching because right now it does appear that this system will take a southeasterly movement and then start to swing out into the central plains, particularly as we get into next weekend, which could bring some pretty potent weather, not next weekend, the following weekend. So we'll keep an eye on this because it looks like February may start out pretty nasty. In terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast, next week, the following Tuesday, takes into consideration the cold shifting to our east and the warm moving into our region. In terms of precipitation, most of it to our north. So Troy, it does look like we've got to bear through about 4 or 5 days of cold weather. We start to see some moderation as we get toward the end of next week and potential for some significant weather the week after that.
Thanks, Al. Back to trivia now, and this week we asked, according to the most recent data released by the USDA, what Nebraska county was the top soybean producer? The answer is A, York County, with an average yield of 69 bushels per acre. Kearney, Hamilton, Buffalo, and Dawson counties round out the top 5. For our final story this week, we wanted to make sure you know about a new agriculture podcast from the folks at CropWatch and the University of Nebraska. It's called the CropWatch Podcast, and it's hosted by Extension educator Michael Sindelar. He came on the show to talk about why podcasts are a great way for producers to get new information and some topics he's excited about covering in future episodes.
Well, one of the biggest benefits with a podcast is it's something that you're not reading. So when I first started my job, I was talking to a couple producers, and they're like, oh boy, another blog from you? I don't know if I have enough time in my day to read another blog. So that's, kind of got my idea of, okay, maybe they need to get information in a different way. So what do they do a lot of? Well, they're in a cab a lot when they're planning, or they may be driving to pick up parts, so they may have a lot of drive time. But that's a chance for them to listen to something. So that's where I was thinking, hey, let's try to get this information in a format where they can just listen to it.
And you're also the host of the podcast. What are some of the topics that you guys will cover on this podcast?
So the first one we covered was corn residue management. We're looking to discuss some early season corn issues, what to look for, kind of how to identify if you're going to have a good yield early in the season. We're going to talk about weed control, especially spring burn down. That's going to be planned for March. So, and then I kind of left the summer open just in case there is a disease issue or a weed issue or an insect issue that comes up that would be really timely to put a podcast out on how to deal with that.
Excellent. And who are some of the people that you interview for the show?
So I'm interviewing a lot of the extension specialists to start with, or other extension educators. I did get a unique chance to interview Dr. Virginia Jin and Dr. Marty Schmier from the USDA for the first podcast. So that was like a really nice way to get a different view on some of the research being done that's not a university view, but that's still data backed. And then I also plan, as I meet more producers or producers become interested in possibly being interviewing ranchers or farmers that are implementing some of the things that we're talking about.
Would you say that ranchers and farmers are the primary audience for this podcast?
Definitely, they're the primary audience for the podcast.
What are some of the goals that you'd like to achieve in the weeks and months ahead with this podcast?
So my first goal is to be consistent so that everybody knows there's going to be a new episode. I'm going to shoot for the third week of each month for a new podcast episode to be out. That's my first one, is to get that consistency down. My next goal is to get better at the editing and the producing side of it, so that way I can do more than just one interview a month, so I can get up to maybe 2 interviews a month.
Okay, so how do we find it, listen, and all that good stuff? One way is to go to the CropWatch webpage, which is cropwatch.unl.edu. You can click on the Listen to Podcast tab on the right side of the screen, and you can also search in your favorite podcast app and find it that way. And since you're adding podcasts to your library, make sure to check out the University of Nebraska Beef Watch podcast too. And hey, there's even a Market Journal podcast. We'd love if you gave us a listen as well. That's going to do it for this week's show. Hope to see you right back here next time. Until then, I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.